Welcome to the DevGraph Tech Talk series. I'm your host, Aaron. In this video, DevSpaces 201, you're already productive using DevSpaces, so now we're going to take it to the next level. We're going to show you advanced project configuration, walk through how to use environment variables effectively, show you how to manage secrets, and also deal with different language versions. And then a really cool part is it's very easy to customize your DevSpace. So we can build IDE extensions to automate kind of basic repetitive tasks and also do some pretty innovative things. So let's get started. So the first thing we'll talk about is how to set up a different language version than what the default image has. This is pretty simple. We reference it in the 101 video, but in the Docker file, you can pretty much do things that you would normally do to set up your image. Here's an example of a gitpod Docker file that sets the default Ruby version to be 2.7.1. And you can see the commands that are being run there to use the Ruby version manager. You could do something similar for Java or for whatever language that you're using. Another kind of topic that comes up is how can I SSH to your DevSpace? You probably might not have a need to do this, but it is possible if you would like to. I'm going to show a configuration that uses Chisel and the Dropbear SSH server to do that. So you're going to take your SSH public key. Now this file is normally located in your .ssh directory. So in my case, if I go to my .ssh, you're going to see the id_rsa.pub. So that's my public key. So we're going to put a copy of that file in an authorized keys file on the server. Then from a client workstation, we can use a Chisel command, or rather we can SSH using Chisel to go to port 8080, which we're going to expose on our DevSpace, and that's going to route to the Dropbear server on port 2020. So all of this can be found in the workshop examples project. We're gonna take a look at the Rails app branch, and that's where we're going to be working on this video. If we take a look at the Docker file for this, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to install Dropbear, and we're also going to install Chisel on the image as well. If we go back and now look at the gitpod YAML, it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to start the TCP tunnel, so that's Chisel listening to port 8080, and then it's going to run the Dropbear server on port quad 2. And it's also going to print out some instructions on how you can connect from your workstation. So there's a little bit of setup involved. I probably would only do this if you really feel like you're going to need it, but certainly there is a way to do it. So we can take a look at how that's going to happen in just a second. So what we can actually do is I'm on the Rails app branch. So let me go ahead, click the DevSpaces button. And so we'll bring up a workspace that's running this branch. Now this is going to do a few things. In addition to the normal workspace setup, it's going to open up all those terminals that we just talked about. And for the example on this branch that we're going to use today, this is a Rails web application. So you can see here what it's doing. It's doing the bundle install. So it's going to be grabbing a number of packages and installing those. So on the initial setup, this will take a little bit longer. Then every subsequent time when you restart your workspace, you won't have to wait through this. It'll already be saved on your workspace. Okay, so the Rails app branch has, not surprisingly, a Rails web app. And so after it built that, it went ahead and started the Rails server, and it opened a preview. And so the preview is actually not able to show for some reason. We're still working through why that is, but you can easily hear this little icon you can open up in a separate browser window. And this is the same mastermind game that we showed in our first video. This is going to work very similar. And if we've hard coded the winning combination to be red, green, blue, yellow, and there we guessed it. So that works similar to our Java application that we showed in the last video. But with regards to the setup that we talked about, so we looked at the gitpod YAML. So we've got a number of terminals here. So here's our TCP tunnel, and this is listening on 8080. It's going to route to our SSH server, which is started up here. And then here we've printed out for our convenience the instructions about how to actually make this work. So I mentioned earlier that we have to put our SSH public key in this authorized keys file. So we've actually already opened it up in the editor here. Now I actually have my public key stored in an environment variable for this workspace. We're going to talk about environment variables later on in this video, so I'll explain more about why that is. But I also have a script that's going to take that environment variable and populate this file. So if I run that Ruby script, now you can see my authorized keys file has my public key in there. So now we're good to go on the server side. We've got everything running. I actually already have Chisel installed on my local workstation. If you haven't done that, the curl command is shown right there in the instructions. And so this SSH command now is what we want to run. Now, if you need to know what the workstation is, what the address is that you're going to SSH to, there's a nice command for you to do that. So remember that we're going to port 8080. So what we can do is we can use the gitpod CLI, and this GP URL 8080 is going to give us the address of this workspace. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And if I put that into that command, I'll paste in the whole command here. So we're going to SSH proxy using Chisel and go to the address of my workstation, or rather my DevSpace, which we just obtained from the gitpod URL. So I'll go ahead and say yes to that. Enter the passphrase for my key. And there you go. So now I am in the gitpod directory. I'm on my workspace now. And the workspace name in our example here is this. And so that's how you can SSH into your DevSpace. If we go back to our workspace here, other terminal windows that we haven't yet looked at are the Rails terminal, and that's where the Rails server is running. And then open ports, these are the three that we've been using. So you can see those there. Now let's talk about a couple of other nice features that you can use regarding file transfers. So there's a storage directory here. So if you click on any of the directories, one of the options that's going to be available to you is this upload file. So if you need to get data files into your DevSpace for processing or testing, you can go ahead and use this. This is going to let you select any file from your local workstation. I'll choose the DevGraph logo here. We'll get that uploaded. And so now that's there, and there's my file. Now likewise, you can also download any files as well. So if I want to hang on to my gem file, I can say download, and that brings it onto my local workstation. So there's some nice file transfer features built right into this. So we've used a couple of CLI commands. We've seen the GP or gitpod URL already. There's also gitpod init, which we've used in the previous video to do some initialization. So you can also do a preview from the command line. So for example, GP preview is going to open up, and we'll do something different just so it's going to show up here, gppreviewexample.com. So in our preview window there, it brought up that page in our browser. If you want to get back to the original or back to your application, what you can do is use a combination of gitpod preview and then that URL command, which gives you the workspace host and for a given port. So in this case, our Ruby web app, our Rails app, is running on port 3000. So here we could do that. And again, unfortunately, that's not loading in our preview right now, but we do know that it is working because when we go to the browser tab, there it is. Okay, so let's talk about environment variables now. So I mentioned that I had my public key in an environment variable, and I can show you that real quickly here. So if I look through the env for mine, I just chose the name my public key. So Gitpod supports encrypted environment variables that are user specific. So these are actually stored as part of your user settings, and you can use these to manage secrets to set access tokens, or any other kind of user specific information. Now, something to note is that while the variables or the values are stored encrypted, once they're in the DevSpace, then they are available as plain text. But how did I set this up? So if I go to the workspaces, and let me refresh this. So there's the one that we have running right now. Here's your user icon. If you look at that underneath settings, let's go to that. So you have a couple of options here regarding email, but what we care about is environment variables. So I just clicked this add variable and I set the my public key to my value. That's all I did. Then that becomes available in your DevSpace. So that's how we got to the point where this env command, it shows up. And there's a number of other ones. If you look for env or environment variables that have gitpod, you'll find a whole bunch. Actually, the gitpod task here, this came from our gitpod YAML, but there's a lot of different interesting things that are here, pointers to the workspace and the username and so on. Now, another gitpod CLI command that's helpful is env. So if we look at that, here are options. We can do an export, we can set and unset. So actually, if I do gitpod env and then -e for export, I only have the one. So this is what this is giving me is if I wanted to export this to a file to run, it's going to set my public key variable. So that's another nice handy trick. Now what I actually did with my script here, so something to point out, in that SSH scenario we talked about, it was actually storing my authorized keys file in my home directory. So notice that when you go to the .ssh, you're actually in home gitpod. We mentioned in an earlier video that only /workspace is saved. So actually, once this workspace stopped and then we had to restart later on, we would have had to reapply that. So here's another use case that we could use the environment variables for. So I've got the script here that's going to basically look for that file, and the function that writes it is actually right here, and it's going to write the value of that environment variable to the file. The key takeaway from this section is that you can use the environment variables to manage secrets for your project. So that may be credentials to connect to your database or to use cloud services such as AWS credentials. You can safely store those in your user environment variables and then access them in scripts or in your DevSpace or in your software. That is in fact the recommended pattern. One last thing we want to cover in this video is the use of extensions. So this icon on the left here is the extensions, and the repository that's used is this Open VSX registry. So it's got a number of extensions, and we should call out that Visual Studio Code extensions are the ones that are supported. You may be asking why Visual Studio Code. So we've got a graphic here that shows the most popular IDEs, and Visual Studio Code actually has surpassed 50%, which may be one of the largest percentages we've seen in quite some time. So that's part of the reason why that was chosen. But you've got a lot of different language extensions here, and also a number of formatting, pretty print tools, things like that. If you don't find what you're looking for, you can also write your own, and you can drag the .vsix file into the extensions view, and you can install your own extensions that way. They're also installed for either at the project level or at my user level across all of my projects. But it's a nice interface. This is directly tied into the repository. So for example, if I'm looking for a Rails plugin, there it is here. It's a single click to install. What I'm going to show here is an interesting little extension called Code Runner. So if I take a look at that, essentially it allows me to run snippets of code just by selecting it from a file. I'll go ahead and install it, and it's a pretty easy one-click install. So now if I take a look at this Ruby file that I had, which installs the SSH key we looked at earlier. Now if I just highlight some text, now I've got a run code option, and there it went ahead and in a new output window just ran that section of text for me. So that's kind of interesting little example of an extension, but you can imagine all sorts of automation and things that you can do with these visual code extensions that run inside of Gitpod. Well, that's it for DevSpaces 201. You've got all the tools now that you need. We hope that you'll use DevSpaces on your next development project. Subscribe to this channel, and we'll catch you on the next DevGraph Tech Talk video.